This episode brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Shifting a little money here, a little there, and hoping it all works out? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can get a better budgeter and potentially lower your insurance bill too. You tell Progressive what you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll help find you options within your budget. Try it today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
He's a retired sergeant from the Connecticut State Police, having served for 26 years. He's now the executive director of Officer Safety and Wellness for the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. He's here to talk about Sandy Hook, the trauma, his experience after, and much more. Of all the radio stations in the United States, there's only one show like ours, the Law Enforcement Today radio show. And on Facebook, there's only one official page. Do a search on Facebook for Law Enforcement Today Radio Show. That's Law Enforcement Today Radio Show on Facebook. When you get there, click like and follow. Joining us from Connecticut, we have Troy Anderson on the phone. Troy is the Executive Director for Officer Safety and Wellness for the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. Their website is nleomf.org. He's also a retired Connecticut State Police Sergeant, served for 26 years, and before retiring, he was Director of Wellness and Resilience and played a big role in Sandy Hook and critical incident debriefing and stress management afterwards. Troy, thanks for your service, number one, and thanks for being a guest on the show. Very much appreciated.
Thanks so much for having me.
By the way, how long ago did you retire from the Connecticut State Police?
I retired in the summer of 2021, and strangely, I retired from the state police twice. I liked it so much, I had to go back for a second round.
Does anybody call you Sarge? I'm a retired sergeant. Does anybody call you Sarge, or is that a term that only happened in police work?
No, I think that there are still some folks that I worked with over the years that affectionately call me that. I hope that it's a title. I hope it's an earned title, but they somehow seem to call me that by default. That's
a very rare thing I hear nowadays. And funny, my wife, the boss, I call her, is always one rank higher than I am. Doesn't matter where I'm at in the chain of command.
We'll call her the lieutenant then.
That's right. So before we get into your story about serving the Connecticut State Police, and in particular about Sandy Hook, which was a tremendously violent situation for everybody, I want people to realize we're not going to talk about the physical traumas. We're not going to talk about the violence, because sometimes it's just too much. And I tell people, I'm a feeble human being. People send me video cams, dash cams, body cam videos. They want my so-called, and I'm air quoting, Troy, expert opinion on this. And I'm like, I don't watch that stuff because it gets me like I'm right back into it, and I don't want to be there. And it messes me up for a long time. So we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the after fact and what Troy did and all those sorts of things. 26 years in any law enforcement agency is a long time. You can see a lot of horrendous things. And I think in addition to Sandy Hook, you've been through the mill, haven't you?
Yeah, I served before the state police. I was a combat veteran, an ODS veteran, Army military police, and also spent some time in the Connecticut Department of Correction, and then 3 years on a municipal police agency. So altogether, definitely north of 30 years, but 26 years with the state. And, I think that there are times where sometimes folks in law enforcement feel like they are having some genetic predisposition. And, you were talking about it very eloquently there as you sort of summarize people either sending you videos or clips or looking for your opinion, or, you stumble across things. And, we're all wired the same way. It's just we're signing up for a different job. And, I think that we do practice resilience, certainly more so now than we ever did in law enforcement or in the military. I think we're learning from our lessons as we go along. I think the Vietnam generation had a very appropriate saying, we know too much to get it wrong this time. And I think, as police work evolves, and so does the work in critical incident stress management, peer support, resilience, the whole thing. As that evolves, I think we're doing better, but there's always, unfortunately, stigma out there, and I think that is one of the more difficult things that we're up against, especially in law enforcement. But we're getting through it, and we're definitely picking up tools along the way, and that's one of the things that we're doing at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, certainly in the Officer Safety and Wellness pillar, and we can talk more about that. I'm sure we will, but I served in a number of capacities as a state trooper, as a road trooper, and of course Connecticut is a very unique state for a number of reasons. The first is that it's one of only 2 states in the country that doesn't have a county form of government. So only about half the towns in Connecticut have organized police forces. The rest are covered by the state police. So when you're a state trooper in a rural area, you'll have several towns that you'll be patrolling, and you're really the only game in town. And then we have a resident state trooper program, which is unique. That's when a town sort of contracts you to be their de facto chief of police, if you will, and in many cases you're overseeing a constabulary. So I had a chance to do that in a couple of different towns. I served as a detective in our Bureau of Criminal Investigation. I was a sergeant overseeing or working in our internal affairs unit for a period of time, and then in 2007, I created a program called STOPS, which is State Troopers Offering Peer Support. And of course, like so many agencies, it was the silver lining of a very dark cloud of some events that happened in the state police, a couple murder-suicides that had happened. And, I think I really recognized at that point, that happened in 2005, I recognized that we were really at a position of disadvantage. We didn't have really any internal programs. We relied heavily upon an external employee assistance program, which was a contract vendor, and they didn't really have a relationship with us. And I don't know that they were necessarily as culturally competent in the clinical category as we would have liked. So after those events, I authored a letter and sent it out to our commissioner and our colonel and our union president, just kind of saying really what we've done right and what we could do better. And the doing better part really included creating a peer support program and critical incident stress management and military support and chaplaincy. So I kind of put together an idea in my head. I wrote it out, and a year later, that letter found its way to the General Assembly, where they sort of codified a public act, bringing that public act, which I believe was, I can't even remember, PA 086 or something. But anyway, that really, they forced the state police to have a peer support program. We did a bunch of work. We brought in some really amazing people and created a steering committee. From that steering committee, we had rank and file folks from the state police. We had executive leadership. We had the Connecticut State Police Union. We had our external employee contract vendor there. We really brought everybody, and we started looking at really what the best practices were being done at the time across the country. Who had peer support? What can we gain from this so we don't have to reinvent the wheel? Adopted what we could, created what we needed to. And then in 2007, the STOPS program was launched. I was fortunate to be selected as the first statewide coordinator, which I served from 2007 to 2017. So I had a good 10-year run with that. And that, I think, is really, as we talk about Sandy Hook and we talk about some of our successes, one of the main things, and we had done a podcast recently looking back on the 10-year anniversary of Sandy Hook, and I brought together a number of key players that were with us for the whole process. And one of the things that really came out of that discussion was how well placed we were. And I will tell you that nobody is going to be 100% ready for Sandy Hook.
We're going to take a short break. We're talking with Troy Anderson on our Law Enforcement Today show. I'll let you know what's coming up. We're going to talk about Sandy Hook, his role with Connecticut State Police, and now what he's doing with being Executive Director of the Officer Safety and Wellness for National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, and how trauma really impacts all of us. This is Law Enforcement Today show. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. If you're on the Clubhouse drop-in audio chat app, be sure to look for me and follow me. My name's John, the letter J, Wiley, Wiley. You can also search for @LET Radio Show. That's John J. Wiley, Wiley, @LET Radio Show on the Clubhouse drop-in audio chat app.
Harmony with Food radio show. I am your host, Meg Marie O'Rourke. In addition to being a radio broadcaster, I am a nutritionist for longer than I'd like to admit on the radio. Join my guests and I as we discuss how to live in harmony with food, from gut health issues, food sensitivities, food intolerances, and the comorbidities of obesity. Being your own healthcare advocate is achievable, and so is living in harmony with food. For the latest nutrition information blogs, check out my website, harmonywithfood.com.
We're returning to conversation with Troy Anderson. He's the Executive Director for Officer Safety and Wellness for the National and Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. Their website is nleomf.org. If you just thought they were about the memorial, you're wrong. They do so much more. He's also retired Connecticut State Police Sergeant, served for 26 years, 30 years in law enforcement altogether. And a big player, I'm not sure how to say this because it always sounds corny, Troy. A big player in officer wellness, mental health, resilience, and peer support, overcoming critical incidents, trauma. The things back in the day when I was policing, what we did is we got a case of beer and sat in a parking lot and drank and talked about it. That's what we did. And for many ways, it worked well, but the beer became an issue. For many people, it did. And we never quite got it out, all of it out. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's, and that's choir practice, and everybody knows what that is. I've had a chance to travel around this country extensively and work with law enforcement, and everybody knows what choir practice is. I think, one of the things that we look at, especially when we look at firefighters, is how mentally resilient firefighters seem to be, and the reality is they do something that's very different than the way we practice our vocation, and that is firefighters respond as a group. Historically, they respond as a group to a crisis or a critical incident or a scene, and then when they're done, they all go back together and they demobilize and they sit together and they normalize the effects of that critical incident by talking about it.
Right.
The difference between what they're doing in firefighting and what we do in law enforcement is that we get back in a car after you get done with a bad scene and you get called to a SIDS death, and then you go to an arson call where somebody lost all of their belongings, and then you're going to an untimely death somewhere or a fatal, and you don't really get an opportunity. So we tend to compartmentalize more. We put that away, and we know that stress is very, very unhealthy. And to be able to package this away, the reality is it's like your attic. You can only put so many boxes in your attic before it's full, and eventually you're going to have to offload that.
One of the things that someone told me a long time ago, in the early days of this show, was they said going to a police academy, what they do is they issue you a state-of-the-art, top-of-the-line at the time backpack. And every call you go on, you're going to throw a pebble, a grain of sand, a boulder into that backpack. And unless you find a way to unload some of that, you're going to get one call that is going to be the thing that breaks the backpack, and you're going to fall apart. How accurate is that as an explanation?
I mean, that is 100% right. I think that one of the things that we're doing much better in law enforcement now is recognizing that we need to combat that. We need to find opportunities to offload that, whether that be through debriefings or diffusings or different interventions. We talking about it. I think when I started in law enforcement 30 years ago, if you were sitting in roll call and somebody brought up, not that they would have, but if they brought up that them and their significant other were involved in some sort of counseling together, they would have been laughed out of the room.
Right.
Or if somebody had said, wow, that was a really bad call, I didn't sleep well last night because of that, I think the sergeant probably would have told you to rub a little dirt on it and get back in the game. And that's not the way it is anymore. I've sat in roll calls, certainly before I retired, and had an opportunity to listen to some of the troopers talk about their experiences in counseling, and they're talking about it very openly. So I think that we've come a long, long way. There's certainly a lot more room to grow here, but we're moving this in the right direction, and we're realizing, I think, that putting that backpack that has now been full and having an opportunity to dump it out it also adds to your longevity. I look at the academy, for example, and you talked about the academy. And I think when folks go through the academy, they are mentally and physically and spiritually probably, you would think, in the greatest place of their life. Physically, they're in good shape. Mentally, they're in good shape. They've gotten through the academy. How is it that 20 or 30 years later at the end of their career, many folks are unrecognizable, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually, right? How are they changed so much? And I think that when you dedicate your life to public service, and in this case, law enforcement, you deserve more at the end of your career than to be sidelined, to feeling detached, to feeling depressed, to being prone to anxiety, to having stress-related physical manifestations when we look at hypertension, and we look at heart disease and cancer and so many things that we know are a direct byproduct of stress. We owe it to ourselves to start thinking about those things now, early in our career. How are we going to take care of ourselves? How am I coming into this profession with childhood traumas? Are there things that I haven't dealt with? I know it's hard to imagine that there have been at least a few people in our vocation that have gone through divorces. That's pretty significant, especially if children are involved. And how are we taking care of ourselves, and what are we doing? Or are we just putting that also in our backpack? Because I think it's important to recognize that it's not just the professional crisis that happen in our life, but there's also personal crisis. And how are we dealing with that? So that really kind of, when I look at this, I look at the prevention, I look at the intervention, and I look at the postvention. And I think part of that prevention is getting into the academy and educating folks young, because you're right. When I entered the academy, they taught us how to do push-ups and shine our shoes,
right,
and we learned motor vehicle and criminal law. But there were no classes back then that talked about the universal and predictable signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress. It didn't exist. It was something that you were going to figure out on your own. The reality is there's no way that you're going to get through a career in law enforcement and not be exposed to traumatic events. There's no way.
Especially if you come from, for example, a lot of the people, I say this as a compliment, I was trained by a lot of combat Vietnam veterans that were police. Mm-hmm. And we had a few commanders, command staff that were Korean War veterans, and they were a special breed of policing. They really taught us the basics. They were really good. But so many of our law enforcement and other first responders are prior military. They're combat veterans, and they're bringing into that equation all that baggage in that backpack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. It's, and as we talk about, I know that there are listeners out there today, and I know we're gonna kind of get a little deeper into Sandy Hook. But one of the messages I think that anybody who's listening to this is that, especially when you're looking at a major critical incident, a major traumatic event like Sandy Hook, it's not a matter of if these things are going to happen. It's a matter of when are they going to happen and where are they going to happen. And here's the other piece: are we prepared if it happens? And if you don't feel like you're prepared, if you don't have the answers now, today is the day to start addressing it. Because if you wait until after an event like that happens in your community, it's too late. This isn't something that you're going to be able to perfect on the run. You might be able to navigate through it, but I promise that you are going to have a lot of collateral damage. And unfortunately, that collateral damage usually equals losing folks along the way, right, either to suicide or, burnout or check out or whatever it might be, early retirement. You lose people to substance abuse, relationships crumble. It's going to be a problem. So start thinking now, what do we have? If this happened in our community,
everybody should start preparing for this, because you made a great point. It's not a matter of if it'll happen, it's when. This is Law Enforcement Today Show. Return our conversation with Troy Anderson in just a few moments. We're going to talk about Sandy Hook and the impact and what they did at Connecticut State Police to help people deal with the impact of that trauma better. This is Law Enforcement Today Show. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
Have you ever wanted to listen to a favorite Law Enforcement Today episode again? Or chat directly with John J. Wiley? Now you can. Download Podopolo for free on either app store and send John J. Wiley a DM right on the app. That's Podopolo, Podopolo.
The This is the Law Enforcement Today Show. Return our conversation with Troy Anderson. He's Executive Director for Officer Safety and Wellness for the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund. Their website is nleomf.org. He's also retired Connecticut State Police Sergeant. He served there for 26 years. His prior military and law enforcement career spans 30 years. A big part of what you went through, and by the way, my wife is from Connecticut originally, and one of the things you said earlier is when she moved south and we had counties, she's like, what are they talking about? I don't understand any of this. I'm like, that explains why. So thanks for elaborating that. The other thing is I met her years after retiring from police work, and she has been really one of the best things for me, because what happened in my first marriage was my inability to handle trauma better was a significant factor in the marriage falling apart, between drinking, argumentativeness, not being able to relax, short-temperedness, all that stuff. It created a huge issue. And she's doing well. My daughters are well, and my current wife as well. But when I saw the news, I guess it's a little over 10 years ago, about the massacre at Sandy Hook at the elementary school, without going into graphic details about all the children that were murdered and the teachers that were murdered, I had a seismic shift. And I thought to myself, and I'd gotten used to not carrying a gun anymore after retiring from police work. That was a conscious decision. That day, I went and got the paperwork for the national, the LEOSA, I think it's called House Resolution 218 or House Bill 218, and got qualified and have been carrying every day since, because I knew in my mind, Troy, that if I was there, I would go in, and at least I'd have a fighting chance. I know that sounds crazy to people who don't think that way, but that's how my mind operates. And like I said, I was a long ways away. So the people that were there, the teachers, the law enforcement officers, the other first responders, EMS, all those, I don't know how they dealt with that.
It's funny that it's not. I wouldn't say it's funny. I've had a chance when you talk to folks all around the country who were impacted by Sandy Hook. One of the things that struck me about a year and a half after Sandy Hook, I had an opportunity to do some lecturing in Europe about critical incident stress management, and was encountering some of the police and fire brigades there. And I was really struck by how affected they were by Sandy Hook. All the way over in Europe. How it impacted them. I think the reality is there are a number of reasons why Sandy Hook was probably one of the most traumatic events that you could imagine, and I think part of it was the fact that it had to do with children. These were young children. They were defenseless children, and it was Christmas time or right before Christmas time, and then there's another component to that, and I think it really is that police pride themselves of being very well trained and very well equipped, and there's a mindset in being a successful law enforcement officer, and that is that my job is to neutralize the threat. It's a preservation of life, and we've been practicing since Columbine active shooter training. We go through it at the academy. We go through it in in-service training. We have better equipment now, and we are really trained to go in and neutralize the threat. And in this case, by the time anybody was able to get into the school and put themselves in a position where they could neutralize that threat, it had already been neutralized, right? So that I think is difficult for responders. I think it's difficult for families that are hearing about it. I think it's everything about that scene was difficult. But I was off duty that day, or at least I was supposed to be. And I got the call in real time that there was an active shooter situation in Sandy Hook, and I made my way there. And by the time I got there, it was still hadn't been, the tactical team was still clearing the building. So technically it was still an active shooter situation. But I think at that point, information had started to roll out how it had ended, that there had been a suicide involved, or at least that's what the presumption was. And, then really I really needed to resort from going from that active shooter neutralized the threat, now I had to kind of shift into what my role was as the state coordinator for our peer support program and our 2 critical incident stress management teams. I had a team in the East and a team in the West, and I had to really kind of do this on the fly. Now, we had planned for situations that were mass casualty events. We had trained for this before, prior to Sandy Hook, but not this type. And you really can never be fully prepared. But we were I think we were really on the cutting edge, the tip of the spear as far as peer support programs at the time in the way that we were training our folks. I knew right away that I had to do some things. And I think that as I look back on those things, they were pivotal in really protecting not only the responders, but my team. Because one of the things I knew is I got to the school and I got to the door and I was talking to some of the folks that were coming out. And these were people that I knew for years. I could tell they were really coming. They were not in a good place, as you can imagine. Many of them were just sort of walking around in a fog. I needed to take them and isolate them to some degree. I needed to get the team who had responded into the school. I needed to record their names to figure out who they were. I needed to make sure that I got them away from the scene to protect them, to make sure that they weren't continually traumatized by being at that event. So we set up a respite center at a nearby state police barracks. And at that center, I made sure that there was food and water. There was a team of peer support people. Critical incident stress management team members were there. We had our chaplaincy team, and we had some from our employee assistance program, and made sure that they got away. Because one of the things that had happened right after the shooting, and we recognized that now it was transitioning to what's our next phase after this. And part of that was figuring out, sadly, that we were going to have to establish death notification teams.
That's one of the worst things to do. It's so hard.
It was very difficult, and unfortunately for me, I was tasked with giving a class to the officers and the chaplains and the clinicians that were doing these death notifications. I had to give them a class in the sort of makeshift meeting room that we had at the nearby firehouse. I had to give a class on what to say and what not to say. In other words, how are we going to deliver this information? And so I knew that I got to
interrupt. They got to go tell a parent that their child has been murdered.
Correct.
And I don't know of any easy way to do this, and the reactions you get are so extreme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very extreme, and I think that the vast majority of the parents or loved ones that were receiving that information at about midnight on the same day, on the 14th, they all, I think, knew, but they needed to hear it, and they needed to hear it in a way that was as compassionate as it could be, and we wanted to ensure that we had the right people making those notifications. We certainly didn't want any of the people that had gone into the school to now go out and do those notifications. So we had to get different officers who hadn't been in the school. And I think that they did a wonderful job. In fact, I stayed until the last notification team came back. And I think that was about 3 a.m. The last team made it back, and we checked them back in. And it was extremely difficult. It was that entire experience. I can't tell you how heavy that was. And, you just knew when all those notification teams left at the same time to go make those notifications, you knew the information that they were delivering and that lives were going to be changed forever. And not just the lives of the people receiving that information, but the lives of the people delivering it.
Absolutely.
So I knew it was incumbent upon my team to make sure that we took care of everybody in the best way that we could. And I think that's, we did that. And part of the way that we
cut you off. We're going to take a short break. We are talking with Troy Anderson. We have so much more to talk about. He's the Executive Director of Officer Safety and Wellness for the National Law Enforcement Officer Memorial Fund, and also retired Connecticut State Police Sergeant. Talking about Sandy Hook and much more. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back. Ever miss an episode of the Law Enforcement Today radio show? Never fear. You can sign up for our free email newsletter and get access to past podcast episodes. Plus, all subscribers are automatically entered in all future contests. Sign up at letradioshow.com. Scroll down to the sign up area. That's letradioshow.com. We promise we will never spam you. Sign up at letradioshow.com.
Are you wondering where you can find more great podcasts? Head to letradioshow.com, click Be Heard, and discover other fantastic podcasts like this one. Also available on our free app, all at letradioshow.com.
Return to conversation on Law Enforcement Today's show with Troy Anderson, Executive Director of Officer Safety and Wellness for National Law Enforcement Officer Memorial Fund. Their website, NLEOMF.org. If you thought all they did was a memorial, you're wrong. They do so much more. He's also a retired Connecticut State Police Sergeant, served 26 years. Before that, his law enforcement career, military and civilian, spanned a total of 30 years. Before we end the break, Troy, we're talking about Sandy Hook, and we're talking about the importance of trying to protect the mental health and wellness. And that's a term that's used a lot. And the term resilience, I think a lot of people get confused with that as well, because for me, it's a foreign concept. I get it now. But when you say trying to protect the mental health and wellness of those making the death notifications of the parents of the children that are killed at Sandy Hook, or teachers, and how traumatic that could be. One of the smart things that you all did is, in my opinion, you use people that were not at the scene. There's not reinforcing the negative. They got to go through the whole visualization again. And these people can't answer questions because they weren't there. I think that's valuable, and I applaud you for that effort. That was great thinking on your part.
Well, I appreciate that. I think one of the key messages that we were able to get out, along with, kind of how to do and how not to do a death notification, is also helping the folks that were on those teams recognizing that this, as difficult as this is going to be, and I think this is a lesson we can all learn in law enforcement, but this is not your trauma, right? While you are exposed to it and you are a part of it, you are going out to this family, and this is their trauma. And this is their worst day, and you are going to be part of that worst day for them. But you can't carry this around. It's not your cross to bear, because you're going to have a lot of traumas in your career. Yeah. Maybe not to this magnitude, but you're going to have a lot of traumas. So, the key, I think, for us was to make sure that when we got done having these, I was at that school for 8 days. So certainly the first day was difficult, but I don't know that any day was less difficult. All the investigation that happened when we were out there was just very, very difficult. But once that was over after 8 days, we really had to focus on what are we going to do for this now intervention and postvention piece. And that began with doing 33 debriefings all around that area. And those debriefings were not just for the 200 plus Connecticut State police personnel that were there, but local and federal partners that were there, fire departments, clinicians that were working for Department of Children and Families and Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, and even some chief administrators from the state of Connecticut who were out at the scene as well. So we had a number of debriefings. We broke those groups up into kind of homogeneous groups, obviously trying to make sure that if you were the first group in the door, you would really want to be in a debriefing with that group, as opposed to traumatizing somebody who was there 2 days later directing traffic down the street. So we broke those groups up. We did those debriefings, and we did debriefings for family members as well, because quite frankly, a lot of the troopers were going home and bringing that with them, and that was difficult. So we made sure that we had spouses and significant others that were invited in, and our plan was to continue to keep doing debriefings until people stopped coming. Now, you can have a discussion about whether debriefings should be voluntary or they should be mandated. I probably lean more toward mandated now. They were voluntary for us.
You're preaching to the choir. Because if you ask me today about certain incidents, I'm not going to talk to you about it. Unless you force me as a police officer, with command staff force me, I'm not doing it. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying it's because I'm John Wayne. That's just my mentality. And I got to ask you this, because a big part of, and I know you'll get this, a big part of our mentality was when you're given a post, you're responsible for everything on that post. And we had a saying, not on my watch. This stuff's not going to happen on my watch. And I'm sure you had men and women, brothers and sisters, who were walking around going, that wasn't supposed to happen on my watch, but it did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm not God. I can't make it all right.
Yeah, we tend to what if things, don't we? What if this? What if that? What if I had been near closer? What if anything? And the reality is, the key at that point is really practicing self-care. I think by making debriefings mandatory, one of the things that you help eliminate is that stigma that we talked about early on. Because if everybody has to go, you can just blame it on the process. It doesn't show. Nobody's going to say, "Oh, you must be weak because you're going to a debriefing."
Blame it on me, the sergeant, and blame it on you, the sergeant. Look, this is what you got to do. Be there at 2:00.
And I think the truth for us was, in the end, we recognized that a lot of the folks that did not come to these voluntary debriefings very often were the troopers and officers that were struggling the most, because they felt like they could deal with it on their own. And unfortunately, they then soon became very isolated and alone with their thoughts, because they didn't have an opportunity to normalize and have that conversation. And one of the greatest things about a debriefing, if somebody's never been to one, is that normalization, that opportunity to have that educational component, to learn a little bit about why this is affecting me, what I can do to help myself, to have the chaplains in the room to address that spirituality piece. Spirituality is big in law enforcement, just like it is in the military. There's that saying in the Army we had, there's no atheists in the foxhole. The reality is, we continued to do those debriefings, but then at some point we also realized that we needed to do more. And part of that more was creating these wellness events, because at some point, if you look at the ICISF, which is the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, you look at their book, it really sort of almost ends after debriefings. So what's the next thing that we do? And the next thing is we just started developing wellness events, and we would have clinicians. We had a couple of trauma-informed psychologists that came in that talked about things like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is a phenomenal modality for law enforcement folks. They really seem to grab onto it. It's very user-friendly. We were learning about things like somatic experiencing and brain spotting. And of course, all of these different clinicians were kind of coming forward saying, try this, but EMDR seemed to be very, very effective. So we had EMDR clinicians, we had chaplains, we had our peer support. We come together and do events and really give opportunities to process and learn. And the more that we hosted those events, the more people started coming and getting engaged that were reticent to do that early on. So they came and joined in. And then as we started recognizing that there were a much smaller minority of folks that were really not recovering or not responding as quickly, we started looking outside of the state to see what other people have done. And I have to give a shout out to the Reverend Dr. Eric Skidmore, who works down in the state of South Carolina. He runs a post-critical incident seminar, a program down there. It's a peer-driven, very intensive program that has EMDR, that has clinicians, that has a spiritual component. I will tell you that program was amazing. Over the year and a half or so after Sandy Hook, we ended up bringing down probably 20 or 30 troopers and officers to those programs in Georgia and in South Carolina. And I think that they're in 13 or 14 states now.
And please tell them I said thank you very much for that. And I can have them on and talk as well. Before we run out of time, this has become kind of your life's mission, because you're carrying on with the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund as Executive Director for Officer Safety and Wellness. I, for years, did not go to the memorial because I was afraid of losing it. And when I worked in radio in Maryland outside of D.C., my wife and I went one day, and it was a cathartic experience for me. It really was. But it was very, very difficult. But that's what I think of the National Law Enforcement Officer Memorial. I don't think of the other things you do. What are some of the things that you do as the Executive Director?
Well, sort of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund at a glance, it's really a three-pillar approach that we have. One, of course, is the Law Enforcement Memorial, which most people are familiar with, and the Candlelight Vigil and that side of the house. But on our campus also is our museum, our National Law Enforcement Museum, right on the campus. It's absolutely beautiful. I'd encourage people to come out and experience that. It's phenomenal. phenomenal. And then our officer safety and wellness programming. And we do a lot more than I think people might know. And again, I would encourage folks, as you have, to take a look at our website, nleomf.org, and take a look at officer safety and wellness. And some of the things that we do, we have a Safe Leo program, which is a suicide awareness for law enforcement officers. We have a program that we do work with there. There's a tremendous amount of information you can find on the website about that. We also have a cooperative agreement with NHTSA. And really, one of the things, when you think about the memorial, you think about the physical plant of the memorial, but it's more than that. Our organization is the leading authority on the certification of line of duty deaths for law enforcement in the country.
That's amazing. By the way, you can get more details and contact Troy. Just go to nleomf.org. Look for our team. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Troy, thanks so much for being a guest on the show. Very much appreciated.
Thanks so much.
I'd like to thank our guests so much for coming on the Law Enforcement Today radio show. The Law Enforcement Today radio show is a nationally syndicated radio show broadcast on numerous stations once a week and growing. If you enjoyed the podcast version of the show, please do me a big favor. Tell a friend. I'll be back in just a couple days with a brand new episode of the Law Enforcement Today radio show and podcast. Until then, this is John J. Wiley. See ya.